what about the challenges you face with respect to data? So I could imagine maybe computers aren't big enough and bad enough, or you have the data but not the analytics. You have the analytics but not the data. You don't have the right workforce. So what are some of the big challenges you face right now as you're looking forward with how to effectively use your data?
I can
Go
start
ahead,
that
Liz.
one. Okay, so we recently moved to a new billing system, which captures all of our customer data. Our original billing system was essentially a bunch of flat files that people could access in various ways with various tools. Our new system is a star schema, which is very, very complicated. And it's not accessible by everybody like the other one was. So we've gone from open access to very closed access. We've gone from a very simple system to a very complicated system. So for example, to pull a year's worth of data to capture all of the utilities, that's probably 400,000 times 4 times 12. So, and that's everybody. And in a recent pull of data, because of the complication of the system and not completely understanding all of the relationships in this new schema, one customer had over 500,000 records for 1 month. Yeah, your face is like, what? And so that's now this particular staff member spends all afternoon deduping this list of data. With this increased size of data, now there are people in my group that will have 2 hard drives and 2 external hard drives just to have it crank through the data. And it's not anywhere near as big as these guys, so I live in a smaller world, but it's very much a challenge when systems are changed and there's not a complete understanding of everybody who's touching that data. The other challenge that we have is that you've got a group of people that need the answers that come from that data, but have no understanding of what it takes to get that answer. So they'll come to us and say, can you tell me how many people in 78745 have used less than 1,000 kW over last summer and live in an apartment? I need that for a council member this afternoon. Like, what? So I'm like, more than 4, but so it's running those analyses with a data set that's essentially brand new to us becomes very, very challenging.
Thank you, Liz.
For us, I'd say one of the we have kind of 2 buckets. My first instinct was to say all of the above to the problems or challenges you described, but from a data perspective, a lot of what we're doing is kind of operationalizing data that has previously been primarily compliance-oriented data. And the way data is used needs to be manifest in what data is collected and how carefully it's managed. And so because we are essentially prescribing a new use for data that might previously only have been used for accreditation purposes or sending reports to state agencies for funding, not to actually drive educational decisions, that means, number 1, it doesn't always have the level of granularity you wish it did. Number 2, it may not have been sort of cleaned as effectively as possible. Lots of the data from digital learning environments has only ever been exhaust. It's never really been consumed for this kind of analysis before. And so that means that there can be problems in it, sort of dirty data, bad relationships, challenges in that data that aren't exposed until you actually work to operationalize it. On the flip side, we're kind of trying to break this chicken and egg problem around the kinds of data that are collected. So if you actually have an infrastructure that allows you to expose useful recommendations to students and faculty and advisors, you would ask a different set of questions and you would track a different set of data. You might do more surveying early on. You certainly want to find out if your students are working part-time or full-time, because that can have an impact on the kind of load they should take and they're likely to being successful. But without a infrastructure for using any of that data, you probably aren't collecting it in the first place. And so there's kind of data, both quality and sufficiency issues that we start with when we first engage with institutions. And then on the other end, just as we're scaling here in Austin, talent is always a challenge, and in particular, finding folks who are sort of creative, problem-solving quants that have this broad set of skills and backgrounds that we're describing, but can function and operate in a business environment. It's not the easiest intersection of personality traits and academic background to identify.
Well,
Keep an eye on the division here, you two. Charles, do you run into any privacy problems when you're dealing with academic records?
Well, you have to kill those completely right in advance, so you don't have a business otherwise. So the primary pieces of privacy legislation in higher education, FERPA, the Federal Education Reporting Privacy Act, gives essentially everybody the right to kind of control who gets to use or see their data. All the data that we're working with is data that institutions already have access to, and in the work that we do in the partnerships that we have with institutions, we're agents of those institutions, so we're covered by the institution's FERPA safe harbors, but we have to have lots of controls around de-identifying and anonymizing all that data if it's ever aggregated across schools, which is part of the work that we're doing, is looking at challenges for students that hold up across institutions. And so if you want to create these sort of analytic sandboxes as we are, where you've got student profiles rather than personally identifiable information, you have to be very careful about making sure that's all blown away and that it is not reverse engineerable in any way before you can sort of take that step. But I think there are really interesting sort of ethical discussions to be had around when institutions get better at using information that they already have and that they've always had. It's not actually disclosure of new information, but this information can now be used in different ways. And I think there are dialogues that sort of have yet to really get started because there hasn't been much practice in this kind of arena yet.
Thank you, Charles. Richard, you have...
Sure. So I think, one area in terms of the computing power that's required, we throw a lot of computing power at our data problems. So we have two scientific computing labs here in Austin that have together over 18,000 processing cores, many terabytes of RAM, and, many petabytes of disk storage. So we throw a lot of computing power at the problem. But nonetheless, we tend to still be limited by processing time. And so we have to be very thoughtful about the types of questions we ask our system and the data sets that we use when asking that system, because otherwise jobs can take many, many hours and even use all of that, those resources. There's another class of problems in data problems. So data can be very dirty. I think that's probably a problem across all of our businesses. And, it is important that you clean the data, that you filter out invalid data, and that you're really thoughtful in how you do that. A unique issue for us is latency. If we're slow in collecting the data and don't put accurate timestamps on it, it loses a lot of meaning. If we're trying to predict what something's worth at a very particular moment in time, to be off by, even what seems like a very small amount of time can really throw those off. Causal relationships can get reversed, and, it loses a lot of meaning in that regard. And then time synchronization is also an issue. We're collecting data in very many different locations with many different computers using different clocks, and to keep those all synchronized so that we can help to understand the meaning is sort of a unique problem in our business a little bit. One funny story about that is that, as a broker-dealer, we're regularly audited, and we've got people coming in all the time and, making sure that we're complying with all the rules and all the laws. And, one of the rules says that a broker-dealer needs to adjust their clocks at least once a day to make sure that they're within a second of each other. And we actually have someone whose job, pretty much at least half of their job, is just keeping all the clocks synchronized. And they're keeping them synchronized to the, picosecond, probably not probably to the, 10 nanosecond precision, millions of times a day across thousands of computers, and putting all the output of this into log files that are, is another whole data set that we could use if we wanted to. And the regulators, of course, were very upset because we didn't have a, notepad where someone wrote in it, that they had checked the clocks like they do to make sure the restroom is clean or something like that. So we had to do some work to convince them that actually our time synchronization was sufficient. And then I'll just sort of mention, another class of problems real quickly about the analytics. So there's noise. The data set that we're doing is incredibly noisy. From almost all measures, you'd look at stock market data, you would look at all of this data, and it looks completely random. The information that's in that noise is very subtle and hard to find. That leads to a couple of other related problems. Well, actually, another point that I make before I get to the third problem is that it's not stationary data. It's not like analyzing a physical process. It's not probably like analyzing problems with a chipset. That just the mere fact of measuring this information and trying to extract information and trading based on it changes what's going on. And you also have thousands of other people all around the world also trying to extract the same information and act on it in the same way. So it's incredibly non-stationary. A relationship that existed yesterday may or may not exist today. And that sort of all culminates in this overfit problem that you probably learn a lot about in very many predictive modeling, in that it's, very easy to predict the past. much harder to predict the future, to paraphrase Yogi Berra on that. And so it's really, we have lots of very smart people with lots of experience modeling all sorts of things and making all sorts of predictions, and we have an incredibly hard time getting them to believe how easy it is to overfit any data set in our business because of the amount of noise and the non-stationarity and everything else. And it just takes time and experience to get used to the fact that pretty much everything you're going to think exists is wrong. And then you've just got to keep trying over and over again until you get something that is, has a little bit more structure to it.
Steve, do you want to tell us some of your challenges?
I think they've all been covered. It's different industries, but it's the same problem with data, right? It's not clean enough. It's not standard. Most of us are dealing with global data sources. The guy that's running the machine in Tianjin, China, didn't capitalize the word the same way that the guy running the machine in Toulouse, France, did. And then when I try to join the data sets, they're not the same, right? They're not standard. They're not. There's just little bits and pieces. Machines don't always work exactly right. If I'm measuring something between 100 and 1,000 milliamps, and all of a sudden I get a 3 amp spike on my machine measurement, that data throws off my entire distribution, right? So how do I make sure that it's clean? How do I make sure that it's filtered? And how do I make sure that it's standard?
Neville, anything to add to that?
I think it's the same thing. I mean, processing time is a big deal. We live in an age now where a microwave is too slow. And our customers expect, they used to want big reports. Now they've started asking for actionable insights. Don't just send me the data. Don't just send me the information. You got to tell me what to do about it. And so they're looking to us to bring those insights, and the processing time on some of this stuff is just too long. You even look at tools like Hadoop and others where you've got 8-hour cycles that you're running through as fast as you can. You can keep throwing horsepower at it, and even with that, we're having to invent our own tools to do certain things, and that comes into talent. Just getting the right kind of people who can really look into this with the right backgrounds and skills, but then an open mind on how to actually solve problems and find opportunities so we can take those to our customers and they can take advantage of it quickly.